Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The train that never stops. Growing up, my family lived near an old abandoned railway that cut through the forest behind our house. The tracks were rusted and overgrown with weeds, and no trains had run on them for decades. My parents warned me not to play near the tracks, but as a kid, the allure of exploring something forgotten was too tempting to resist. One summer evening, while playing near the tracks with my friend Marcus, we heard a faint sound in the distance, the distant whistle of a train. "That's impossible," Marcus said, frowning. "These tracks haven't been used in years." But the sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel. We stared at each other, unsure of what to do, before ducking into the bushes to watch. Moments later, a train appeared around the bend. It was massive and black, its sleek cars gleaming faintly in the fading light. Smoke billowed from its chimney, curling into the evening sky. The train's windows were dark, but the faint outline of figures inside sent a chill down my spine. They were still, unmoving, like mannequins seated in rows. The train didn't slow as it approached, its whistle piercing the air. It barreled past us with a rush of wind, the ground trembling beneath our feet. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone, disappearing into the forest as if it had never been there. We ran home, breathless and terrified. When we told my parents, they dismissed it as a prank or an overactive imagination. But I knew what we'd seen, and Marcus swore he'd heard stories about the ghost train that haunted the old tracks. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of the whistle again. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as the faint clatter of wheels reached my ears. It was louder this time, closer. I crept to the window and peered out, expecting to see the train in the distance. Instead, I saw its headlights cutting through the trees, coming directly toward my house. The whistle blared, deafening, as the train passed just beyond the backyard. The windows were still dark, but this time, the figures inside weren't seated. They were standing, pressed against the glass, their faces pale and hollow, their mouths stretched into silent screams. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The train returned every evening after that, its whistle echoing through the forest. My parents claimed they never heard it, but Marcus did. One night, he told me he was going to follow it to see where it went. He never came back. The face in the attic. When my parents bought an old Victorian house in the countryside, I thought it was the coolest place I'd ever seen. It had spiral staircases, creaky wooden floors, and an attic that seemed to stretch on forever. My dad planned to renovate it, and my mom was thrilled at the idea of fixing it up. The attic was the one place in the house I avoided. It wasn't the dust or the cobwebs that bothered me. It was the feeling. The air was always colder up there, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. My parents laughed it off, telling me it was just my imagination. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic for hidden treasures, I found an old mirror leaning against the far wall. Its ornate frame was tarnished with age, and its glass was coated in a thin layer of grime. I wiped it clean with my sleeve, and that's when I saw it. A face. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even human. Its features were sharp and angular, its eyes hollow and black. It stared at me from the other side of the glass, its lips curling into a faint smile. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of boxes. When I looked again, the face was gone. My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, a combination of shadows and dust playing tricks on my mind. But the face kept appearing. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow that lingered too long. Then it became more deliberate. I'd see it in the mirror, its gaze following me as I moved. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it in other reflective surfaces around the house, the windows, the kitchen sink, even the TV when it was turned off. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse scurrying in the walls, but it grew louder, more insistent. The sound was coming from the attic. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head, but the scratching turned into a low, guttural growl. The sound of something dragging across the floorboards above my room sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I told my parents, but they brushed it off. "It's probably raccoons," my dad said, promising to check the attic later. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it again, the dragging sound accompanied by faint whispers. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was cold, and the smell of mildew was stronger than ever. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stacks of old boxes and forgotten furniture. The mirror stood where I had left it, its surface gleaming faintly. And then I saw it, the face, clearer than ever, its eyes locked onto mine. It moved this time, its hand pressing against the glass from the other side. The whispers grew louder, filling the attic with a chorus of voices I couldn't understand. The glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I ran, slamming the attic door behind me and locking it. My parents found me trembling in my room, unable to explain what had happened. My dad went up to check, but he found nothing. No mirror, no scratches, no sign of anything unusual. We moved out a few months later. The house is still there, empty and abandoned. But sometimes, when I pass by, I swear I see something in the attic window. A face, staring back at me, waiting for someone foolish enough to return. The forgotten carnival. When I was a kid, there was a stretch of woods behind our neighborhood that everyone said was cursed. Parents warned their children not to play there, whispering stories about strange lights and voices that lured people deeper into the trees. Like most kids, I dismissed the stories as nonsense, until the summer I turned 12. That was the year I discovered the carnival. It was late July, the air heavy with humidity, when my friend Sam and I decided to explore the woods. We brought flashlights and a backpack full of snacks, determined to spend the day pretending to be adventurers. By mid-afternoon, we were deep into the forest, the dense canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. That's when we heard it, the faint sound of music. It was distant but unmistakable, a jaunty tune, the kind you'd expect to hear from a carousel. Sam and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks. "Is there a fair nearby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing out here," I said, my stomach twisting with a mix of excitement and unease. But the music grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of voices and the occasional burst of laughter. We followed the sound, weaving through the trees until we stumbled upon it. A carnival nestled in a clearing. The rides were old-fashioned but immaculate. Brightly painted carousels, towering Ferris wheels, and spinning teacups that gleamed in the afternoon light. Strings of multicolored lights hung overhead, glowing faintly despite the daylight. Vendors lined the paths, their carts laden with cotton candy, caramel apples, and popcorn. The strangest part, though, was the people. They were dressed in vintage clothing, like something out of an old photograph. Women in flared skirts and men in suspenders and hats moved between the booths, their faces pale and expressionless. Children ran laughing through the paths, but their laughter sounded off, like it didn't belong to them. "Where did this come from?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my eyes fixed on the Ferris wheel. It turned slowly, its seats empty despite the crowd milling around below. A man in a striped jacket appeared in front of us, his grin too wide. "Welcome," he said, his voice booming. "You're just in time for the fun." Sam and I backed away, but the man's smile only grew. "Don't be shy," he said, spreading his arms wide. "There's plenty for everyone." "I think we should go," I whispered, tugging on Sam's sleeve. But Sam was staring at the carousel. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his eyes glassy. Before I could stop him, he was walking toward it, drawn like a moth to a flame. "Sam," I called, but he didn't turn around. I ran after him, pushing through the crowd. The people barely noticed me, their faces blank and their movements stiff. When I reached the carousel, Sam was already on one of the horses, his face serene as the ride began to spin. "Get off," I shouted, but he didn't respond. The music grew louder, more chaotic, as the carousel picked up speed. The horses moved faster and faster, their painted eyes glinting in the light. Sam's expression didn't change, but his body began to blur, like he was fading into the ride itself. I screamed and lunged for him, but a pair of hands grabbed me from behind. The man in the striped jacket loomed over me, his grin impossibly wide. "It's not your turn yet," he said, his voice low and cold. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the forest floor, the carnival gone. The clearing was empty, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken glass. I called for Sam, but there was no response. He had disappeared. The adults didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They searched the woods but found no trace of a carnival or Sam. The official story was that he had run away, but I knew the truth. Even now, years later, I can sometimes hear the faint strains of carousel music drifting through the trees, calling me back. And though I know better, part of me wonders if Sam is still there, spinning endlessly on that cursed ride. The Forgotten Tenant. After college, I moved into a small apartment in a building that was well past its prime. The walls were thin, the pipes groaned, and the elevator worked only half the time. But the rent was cheap, and I didn't have many options. My neighbor across the hall was an elderly woman named Mrs. Wilkes. She was kind but quiet, always shuffling in and out of her apartment with a faint smile. One evening, as we chatted in the hallway, she said something that stuck with me. "Watch out for the man in 4B, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "There's no one in 4B. It's been empty since I moved in." Her smile faded, and her expression grew serious. "It's better that way," she said. "If you see him, don't talk to him." I laughed it off, assuming she was confused. But a few weeks later, I started hearing noises coming from 4B. Faint whispers, footsteps. and the sound of furniture scraping against the floor. I mentioned it to the landlord, but he insisted the apartment was still vacant. One night, as I was heading to bed, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. The knock came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from 4B. My heart pounded as I approached the door. "Hello?" I called out. The knocking stopped. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low, gravelly, and impossibly close. "Let me in." I stumbled back, slamming the door to my own apartment and locking it. The knocking resumed, more insistent now, echoing through the thin walls. I stayed awake all night, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for it to stop. By morning, the knocking was gone, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I asked Mrs. Wilkes about it the next day, but she only shook her head. "He's always been there," she said. "You're better off ignoring him." A week later, Mrs. Wilkes passed away in her sleep. The landlord claimed she had no family, so her apartment was cleaned out quickly. That night, I heard the knocking again, not from 4B, but from my own door. I moved out the next day. But sometimes when I pass the building, I see a shadow in the window of 4B. And though I know better, I can't help but wonder if it's waiting for someone else to answer. The road that loops. There's a road outside my hometown that everyone calls the Loop. Officially, it's just a stretch of 2-lane highway that winds through the woods and eventually connects back to the main road. On maps, it's a perfect circle. To the locals, though, it's more than just a road. It's a trap. The stories varied depending on who you asked. Some said the loop was cursed, that it had been built over sacred ground. Others claimed it wasn't a real road at all, that it existed outside of time, feeding off those who dared to drive it after dark. Most of the stories ended the same way. People who drove the loop too many times disappeared. I thought it was all just urban legend, a way for locals to scare teenagers into staying home at night. That is, until the night I decided to drive it myself. It was a warm summer evening, and my friends and I were bored. We'd exhausted all the usual options, movies, fast food, aimless drives around town, when someone suggested the loop. "Let's do it," my friend Jess said, grinning. "Let's see if it's as creepy as everyone says." "Worst case, it's just a boring drive," added Sam, the designated skeptic of the group. I agreed, mostly to prove I wasn't scared. We piled into Jess's car, her beat-up sedan rattling slightly as we headed out of town. The road was easy to find, a narrow stretch of asphalt cutting through dense woods. At first it seemed ordinary enough. The trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. The headlights illuminated the pavement ahead, reflecting off the occasional road sign. We joked and laughed, the tension fading as the miles rolled by. But then, something changed. The air grew heavier, the trees pressing closer to the road. The headlights seemed dimmer, their beams swallowed by the darkness. The radio, which had been playing quietly in the background, cut out, replaced by static. "Did anyone else feel that?" Jess asked, her voice uneasy. "Feel what?" Sam replied, though his tone suggested he felt it too. Jess didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead, gripping the wheel tightly. The road seemed longer now, stretching endlessly into the dark. The GPS on her phone had stopped working, the screen stuck on a loading symbol. "We should turn around," I said, my voice trembling. Jess nodded, slowing the car and making a wide U-turn. For a moment, relief washed over me as we headed back the way we came. But then I noticed something strange. The road was the same. The same signs, the same trees, the same bends. It was as though we hadn't turned around at all. The radio crackled, and the static grew louder, almost rhythmic, like a low, distorted heartbeat. "This doesn't make sense," Jess muttered, her knuckles white on the wheel. We drove in silence, the car's engine the only sound. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I glanced out the window and froze. There was a figure standing by the side of the road. It was tall and thin, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Its head was tilted slightly, and its arms hung limply at its sides. As we passed, it turned slowly, its hollow eyes catching the glow of the headlights. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "See what?" Jess asked, her eyes fixed on the road. I didn't answer. The figure was gone. The road stretched on, looping endlessly, the scenery repeating itself like a broken record. The same signs, the same bends, the same trees. Jess drove faster, the car rattling as the speedometer climbed. I could feel the fear in the car, unspoken but palpable. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. Jess slammed on the brakes, and we rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Great," Sam muttered, though his voice was tinged with fear. "Now what?" We sat in silence, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air was still, too still, and the static on the radio grew louder, more distorted. And then we heard it, faint footsteps coming from somewhere behind us. "Don't look," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Whatever you do, don't look." I stared straight ahead, my heart pounding as the footsteps grew closer. They were slow and deliberate, like someone or something was taking its time. A faint tapping sound followed, like fingernails brushing against the side of the car. The air grew colder, and I could feel my breath hitching in my chest. The tapping moved to my window, slow and deliberate. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow, its form indistinct but wrong, hovering just outside the glass. I closed my eyes, gripping the seat, praying it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. The air grew lighter, and the static on the radio faded into silence. Jess turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without a word, she slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as we sped down the road. This time, the trees parted, and the lights of town appeared in the distance. We didn't stop until we were back in Jess's driveway, the car idling as we sat in stunned silence. No one spoke about what we'd seen or heard, but none of us ever drove the loop again. Even now, years later, I hear stories about the road, people disappearing, cars breaking down, strange figures in the woods. And though I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I can still feel the weight of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, following us into the dark.